Some people don't raise their voice. They don't shout. They don't insult directly. They smile. And yet somehow after talking to them, you feel smaller than you did before. You replay the conversation in your head. The tone was calm. The words sounded harmless. So why do you feel dismissed? Undermined. Quietly pushed down. This is how it usually begins. People who like to put others down rarely look cruel on the surface. In fact, many of them appear confident, successful, even charming. They don't need to scream superiority. They whisper it, a small comment about your idea, a joke that lands just a little too sharp. A reminder of your mistake brought up casually as if it's nothing. And you tell yourself you're being sensitive. You tell yourself they didn't mean it that way. You tell yourself to move on, but your body remembers. There's a strange emotional weight that lingers after interactions like this. A quiet discomfort, a feeling that something was taken from you even though nothing obvious happened. And that's because what you experienced wasn't an accident. People who habitually put others down are not driven by strength. They are driven by something far more fragile. Insecurity that learned how to dress itself as confidence. At some point in their life, usually early on, they learned a painful lesson. They learned that being themselves wasn't enough to feel safe. So, they adapted. Some people adapt by becoming quiet. Others adapt by becoming people pleasers. And some adapt by stepping on others emotionally just enough to feel taller. Putting others down becomes a way to regulate their inner chaos. Not because they enjoy hurting people, but because in that moment they finally feel steady. If you strip away the behavior, what you often find underneath is fear. Fear of being overlooked. Fear of being exposed. Fear that if they are not superior, they will be invisible. For these individuals, self-worth is not something that grows internally. It is something they measure externally. And the easiest way to feel above is to make someone else feel below. This pattern often starts in environments where comparison was constant, homes where praise was conditional, schools where worth was ranked, families where love felt competitive instead of secure. When a child grows up feeling evaluated rather than understood, they don't learn self-acceptance. They learn positioning. They learn where they stand in relation to others. And that mindset doesn't disappear in adulthood. It simply becomes more subtle. As adults, these individuals often disguise their need for dominance as honesty. I'm just being real. I'm just telling the truth. I'm just helping you improve. But real honesty does not shrink people. And help does not leave you feeling ashamed. What's happening psychologically is a quiet power exchange. By pointing out someone else's flaw, they momentarily escape their own. By highlighting someone else's weakness, they distract from their own vulnerability. It's a short-lived relief because the problem is this sense of superiority never lasts. So, they need to repeat it again and again. This is why these behaviors become patterns, not isolated moments. The comments return, the subtle jabs continue. The comparisons never stop. It's not because you keep failing. It's because they keep needing reassurance. And the tragedy is this. The more someone relies on putting others down to feel stable, the more fragile their inner world becomes. Because their confidence is built on shifting ground, it depends on someone else always being lower. And life doesn't work that way. Sooner or later, they encounter someone they can't diminish. Someone whose presence doesn't shrink, someone who doesn't react. And that's when their behavior intensifies. They become sharper, more critical, more dismissive because nothing threatens a fragile ego more than emotional independence. People who are secure don't need to dominate conversations. They don't need to win every interaction. They don't need to correct others constantly. Secure people are not threatened by differing opinions. They don't feel exposed when someone else shines. They can sit in silence without feeling erased. In contrast, People who put others down often struggle deeply with silence. Silence forces them to face themselves, and that's uncomfortable. So they fill the space with judgment. They speak quickly. They interrupt. They one-up. They subtly reposition themselves as more informed, more capable, more experienced. And if you challenge them, they rarely respond with curiosity. They respond with defensiveness. Because for them, disagreement doesn't feel like dialogue. It feels like danger. Their identity is tightly bound to being right, being better, being admired, and any threat to that identity feels personal. What many people don't risk gone wrong. It is survival learned too early. Often these individuals were not emotionally mirrored as children. Their feelings were dismissed, their struggles minimized, their needs overshadowed. So they learn to protect themselves by projecting strength. But strength without safety becomes armor. And armor is heavy. Underneath that armor is often a deep sense of inadequacy. They never learned how to process. A quiet belief that if they stop performing, they will disappear. So they keep performing. They perform intelligence. And if they perform dominance, they perform indifference. And they measure their worth by how much space they occupy compared to others. This is why interactions with them feel draining. You are unknowingly participating in their emotional regulation system. Your self-doubt becomes their relief. Your silence becomes their validation. Your discomfort becomes their control. But here's the part that matters most. Understanding this does not mean excusing it. Empathy does not require self-eresia. You can recognize the psychology behind the behavior without allowing it access to you. Because while their wounds may explain their actions, they do not justify the impact. And the impact is real. People who are repeatedly put down begin to question themselves. They hesitate before speaking. They shrink their ideas. They internalize criticism that was never constructive. Over time, this creates a subtle erosion of self-trust. And that is not harmless. So what do you do when you recognize this pattern? First, you stop personalizing it. Their behavior is not a reflection of your value. It is a reflection of their unmet needs. Second, you observe instead of react. Reaction feeds the dynamic. Observation weakens it. People who rely on dominance need emotional response to feel effective. When they don't get it, their strategy loses power. Third, you strengthen your internal anchor. The stronger your sense of self, the less their words land. Not because you become numb, but because you become rooted. You don't need to prove yourself to someone who is still trying to prove themselves to the world. And perhaps the most important realization of all is this. People who genuinely like themselves do not enjoy making others feel small. They don't need to. Their self-worth is not built in comparison. It's built in presence. And presence is something no one can take from you. Not with words, not with tone, not with subtle dismissal. Because once you see this pattern clearly, it loses its grip. You stop asking what did I do wrong? And you start asking, what is this really about? And in that moment, the power shifts quietly, naturally, without conflict. Because the most unsettling thing for someone who needs to feel above others is someone who no longer plays below. Over time, these patterns don't stay confined to casual conversations. They begin to shape relationships, workplaces, and even families. In close relationships, people who put others down often blur the line between honesty and control. They frame criticism as concern. They frame dismissal as realism. And slowly the other person begins to doubt their own perception. You start asking for approval without realizing it. You begin editing your thoughts before speaking. You feel tense around them, even during calm moments. This isn't because you're weak. It's because the human nervous system is wired to respond to subtle emotional threats. When someone repeatedly lowers you, your body prepares for self-protection. It tightens. It hesitates. It becomes watchful. And the person doing the lowering often interprets this as confirmation of their superiority. In work environments, this behavior can be especially damaging. These individuals often position themselves as standards enforcers. They highlight mistakes publicly. They question competence indirectly. They use authority, experience, or knowledge as a shield. But what they rarely do is empower. True leadership builds capacity. This behavior erodes it. The irony is that many of these individuals are deeply afraid of being replaced. So they suppress growth around them. Not consciously but instinctively. When someone else improves, it triggers comparison. And comparison threatens their fragile sense of importance. So they critique, they undermine, they subtly remind others of hierarchy. And over time, the environment becomes tense, quiet, and risk-averse. Creativity fades in spaces where people feel evaluated instead of supported. In families, this pattern often feels normalized: a sibling who constantly corrects, a parent who minimizes achievements, a relative who turns every conversation into a comparison. Because it's familiar, it feels unavoidable. But familiarity does not mean health. Many adults carry voices in their head that were never theirs to begin with. They repeat judgments they absorbed long ago. They confuse criticism with truth. And this is where the cycle continues. People who were once put down often become people who put others down. Not because they want to, but because they learned that worth is something you defend, not something you embody. Breaking this cycle requires something that feels uncomfortable at first. Self-awareness. For the person who puts others down, awareness is threatening because it exposes the gap between the image they project and the insecurity they hide. And that gap is painful to look at. But for the person on the receiving end, awareness is liberating. It allows you to separate behavior from identity. It allows you to respond instead of absorb. You begin to see patterns instead of taking things personally. You notice how their criticism spikes when they feel uncertain. How their tone shifts when they feel challenged. How their need to dominate grows when they feel unseen. And once you see this, something changes. You stop engaging emotionally in their inner battle. Because it was never yours to fight. This doesn't mean you become distant or cold. It means you become grounded. You choose clarity over confusion. Boundaries over explanation. Sometimes that boundary is silence. Sometimes it's a calm statement. Sometimes it's emotional distance, not punishment, protection. One of the hardest lessons to accept is that not everyone wants mutual respect. Some people want control disguised as connection. And when you stop offering that control, the relationship may shift. They may become irritated. They may escalate. They may accuse you of changing. And in a way, they're right. You change because you stop shrinking. That's often the moment when people reveal their true intentions. Those who value you will adjust. Those who needed you small will resist. This is not a failure. It's clarity. What's important to understand is that emotional strength does not come from winning these interactions. It comes from not needing to. The moment you stop measuring yourself against someone else's insecurity, you regain your center. And from that center, something powerful happens. You begin to speak more clearly.